The human species has been on Earth for about 200,000 years. That's a very brief stay in evolutionary time. During this period, humans have faced many crises. Just keeping to Europe and the modern period, the 30 Years' War in the 17th century was devastating. It exterminated perhaps a third of the population of Germany. There's no need to review the record of the 30 Years' War of the 20th century, 1914 to 1945. That hideous war came to an end in August 1945. On August 6th, we learned that human intelligence had devised the means to bring the human experiment of 200,000 years to an end. It was never seriously in doubt that the capacity to destroy would escalate, would diffuse to many hands, increasing the threat of self-annihilation. There have been many opportunities to significantly reduce, even eliminate the threat. Most have been ignored, sometimes in quite remarkable ways. No time to go into it, but it's an astonishing record. Opportunities still exist, and eliminating the scourge is not a utopian dream, although barriers are significant. It's a good deal to say about this revealing history and the current options, but I'll put that aside here. Well, returning to April 6, 1945, on that grim day, humanity entered into a new era, the nuclear age, one that is unlikely to last long. The record of very close calls, in some cases reaching literally minutes from terminal disaster, that record is utterly appalling, usually from accident or error, in a few shocking cases from recklessness of leadership. Furthermore, the threat is escalating right now, right at the Russian border. Leading authorities warn, with good reason, that the threat of nuclear war today is approaching the level of some of the most dangerous moments of the nuclear age. And the record makes it quite clear that either we will bring the nuclear age to an end, or it'll bring us to an end. Well, it was not realized in 1945, but we now know that a second and no less critical era was beginning at the same time, a new geological epoch, what's called the Anthropocene, an epoch defined by extreme human impact on the environment. By now it's understood that we're well into this new epoch, and also well into a period of species destruction, the sixth extinction, it's called, comparable to the fifth extinction 66 million years ago, when an asteroid hit the Earth, destroying 75% of the species on Earth, ending the age of the dinosaurs, opening the way for small mammals, ultimately humans, very recently. And it hasn't taken us much time to duplicate the achievements of the asteroid, though with some differences. In the sixth extinction, the one now underway, large animals are being destroyed at a disproportionate rate. That's a characteristic feature of human history of the last 200,000 years. This is unlike earlier extinctions. Well, that we're now well into the Anthropocene is widely recognized, but there has been disagreement about just when changes became so extreme as to signal the onset of this new geological epoch. A few months ago, the official working group on the Anthropocene reached a conclusion on the matter, recommending to the International Geological Congress that the dawn of the Anthropocene should be given the same date as the dawn of the nuclear age, the end of World War II, August 1945. That's when really radical changes in the environment under human impact became quite dramatic. So according to their analysis then, the Anthropocene and the nuclear age coincide, posing a dual threat to the perpetuation of organized human life. Without exaggeration, we might identify the end of World War II as the moment when the lemmings in human form set off on their determined and disciplined march to the precipice, to terminal disaster. We learned a lot more about this determined and disciplined march to disaster on November 8th of this year, perhaps another date of historic significance, judging by the massive coverage and the intense scrutiny that the events of that day have received. The general tone of the coverage was captured eloquently by the front cover of German weekly Der Spiegel. It was a caricature of a huge Donald Trump. He's depicted as a meteor hurtling towards a small globe, his mouth wide open to devour it, with a headline reading, "Das Ende der Welt," end of the world. And in smaller letters down below, wie wir sie kennen, as we know it, so the end of the world as we know it. And there are indeed reasons to believe that the November 8th events signaled the end of the world as we have known it, even though not in the sense that's intended in this account and many others like it. There were actually two major events on November 8th. One was the U.S. elections, in which the Republican Party took over all three branches of government, the executive, legislative, very soon the Supreme Court, the judicial branch. And that event received extraordinary coverage, continuing for weeks. It's hard to recall anything like the scale or the intensity. The second major event of November 8th received virtually no coverage, although a good case can be made that it was far more significant than the elections. And it may indeed portend the end of the world as we know it. I'm referring to an event that took place on November 8th in Marrakech, Morocco, at the COP22 conference. That's where 200 countries were meeting to try to carry forward the agreements reached in Paris at COP21, December 2015. In Marrakech on November 8th, the World Meteorological Organization delivered a study assessing the current state of the Anthropocene. The study reported that the past 5 years have been the hottest on record, with this year poised to break the record again. Sea levels are rising at a rate that is soon to increase, perhaps quite sharply, as a result of the unexpectedly rapid melting of the enormous polar ice, especially the enormous Antarctic glaciers, which are bound to raise sea level by many meters. Already the World Meteorological Organization reported Arctic sea ice over the past 5 years is almost 30% below the average for the preceding 30 years. That's very significant. It reduces the cooling effect of polar ice reflection of solar rays and thereby accelerates the disastrous effects of global warming, including sea level rise. The study, same WMO study, reported further that temperatures are already approaching dangerously close to the 1.5 degrees centigrade goal that was established at Paris in COP21 and included other dire reports and forecasts. The goal at Marrakesh was to work out ways to implement the COP21 Paris agreements by providing a detailed blueprint for action. Didn't work out that way because of the second event of November 8th, the U.S. elections. The Marrakesh conference opened and set to work on November 7th. On November 8th, the WMO report was delivered. On November 9th, the tenor of the conference changed completely. The question now dominating the conference was whether the president-elect in the United States would indeed withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement, as he had promised to do. And the question on everyone's mind was whether the agreement could survive such a blow. The conference continued under this dark shadow, coming to an end with almost no substantive results. What we've just been witnessing is quite remarkable. At the Marrakesh conference, there was a country that was leading the way in upholding the hopes for civilized survival, China. That's in the lead in carrying the hopes for survival. In the lead in dragging the world to disaster is the leader of the free world, the most powerful country in world history, which has just delivered a serious blow to the hopes for survival of organized human society. It's not easy to find appropriate words to describe this spectacle or the fact that it's not commented on. In fact, what we've been witnessing for the past several months is no less astounding. The U.S. electoral extravaganza has transfixed the world, but for strange reasons. What has captured the world's attention is what Mitt Romney called, his words, the bullying, the greed, the showing off, the misogyny, the absurd third-grade theatrics of Trump's performances. That's what has transfixed the world. Meanwhile, the most significant fact about the electoral process has barely been mentioned, namely the strict avoidance of issues on all sides. That includes the two most important crises that the human species has ever faced in its 200,000 years on Earth: the threat of nuclear war, the threat of environmental catastrophe. The threat of nuclear war, which is by now quite severe, was barely mentioned. Climate change, in contrast, was not entirely ignored. In the Republican primaries, on which world attention was focused, every single candidate, without exception, rejected the aspirations of the Paris and Morocco conferences. And most of them simply denied that what is happening is happening. The only exceptions were those who were praised as sensible moderates, like Jeb Bush, who said the science is uncertain, but we don't have to do anything because we're producing more natural gas thanks to fracking. The other moderate was Ohio Governor John Kasich, who agreed that global warming is probably taking place, but added in his words, he's the Ohio governor, "We are going to burn coal in Ohio, and we're not going to apologize for it." That's 100% denial. The winning candidate calls for a rapid increase in use of fossil fuels, including coal, the most dangerous, eliminating regulations, virtually dismantling the Environmental Protection Agency, a rejection of any help to developing countries that are seeking to move to sustainable energy. That's a primary plank of the Paris and Marrakesh conferences, and in general, racing to the cliff as quickly as possible. Republican denialism has already had a significant impact. It had been hoped that the COP21 Paris negotiations would lead to a verifiable treaty, but that hope was abandoned because the Republican Congress in the United States would not accept any binding commitments. So what emerged was a voluntary agreement, obviously much weaker. And now the follow-up Marrakesh conference ended with little issue because of the concern that it may all be in vain because of the stand of the leader of the free world. It's again hard to find words to describe what's happening, and for the fact that it's barely mentioned in the massive coverage of these issues, these events. Well, the impact of global warming may soon become even more vividly apparent than it already is. So take, say, Bangladesh. In Bangladesh alone, tens of millions of people are expected to have to flee from the low-lying plains in coming years because of sea level rise and more severe weather. That's going to create a migrant crisis that makes today's pale into insignificance. With considerable justice, Bangladesh's leading climate scientist says that these migrants should have the right to move to the countries from which all these greenhouse gases are coming. And millions should be able to go to the United States and to the other rich countries that have grown wealthy while bringing about the new geological era that may be the final one for the species. These catastrophic consequences can only increase, not only in Bangladesh, but in fact in all of South Asia, as temperatures, which are already intolerable for the poor, inexorably rise, and the Himalayan glaciers continue to melt, threatening the entire water supply for South Asia. Already in India, some 300 million people are reported to lack adequate water to drink. A moment's thought is enough to make it brutally clear that the two threats to survival begin to converge at this point. India and Pakistan are, of course, two nuclear-armed states. They are likely to face severe shortages of water in the near future. They're already close to war, and conflicts over water might trigger the catastrophe, which is likely to move quickly to nuclear weapons, with disastrous consequences for the region. And worse yet, any really large resort to nuclear weapons might bring about the final curse of nuclear winter and global famine. That's a terminal disaster for the species, as scientists have been warning for some years. All happening without comment. Meanwhile, at the Russian border, both sides are engaged in provocative actions, dangerous military buildups. Note the Russian border, not the Mexican border. There's an important story there. And the West which should be in the lead in grappling with these existential issues, is in disarray, which much of the population consumed with anger, fear, distrust, contempt for established institutions. So the phrase "Das Ende der Welt" may not be entirely inappropriate, if not quite for the reasons that were intended. It's all too easy to conjure up other grim and unfortunately not implausible scenarios, but there are some rays of hope as well. So just keeping to the American elections, the Republican Party, while taking over the entire government, actually received a minority of votes, 2 million less than the Democrats by current counts, which are not yet complete. Among younger voters, Clinton won easily, and even more significant, an overwhelming majority of younger voters supported Sanders over the two official candidates and supported what he calls a political revolution. Actually, it's an interesting phrase. Sanders is in fact a dedicated and honest New Deal Democrat. His programs would not have surprised General Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower, president in the 1950s. That the proposals are depicted as a political revolution is yet another sign of how far politics have drifted to the right in the neoliberal era. The coming French elections are another dramatic illustration of that. Furthermore, many Trump voters had in fact voted for Obama in the earlier elections. They were beguiled by the slogan, hope and change. Then they were disillusioned when there was no change and not much hope. One can easily conceive of the possibility of a progressive coalition that would bring about the change and hope that is rightly demanded by the victims of the neoliberal assault on the population in the past generation. The fact, for example, that at the peak of the much heralded economic miracle in 2007, right before the crash, the real wages of working people in the United States were well below what they had been 25 years earlier, when the neoliberal programs were just being initiated. Similar, often harsher effects in Europe. The impact of similar policies in Europe has been, in many ways, even more severe than in the United States, particularly since the crash and the destructive austerity programs that followed, which may be enhanced further in France, for example. Well, keeping still to the United States, some of Trump's policies might make good sense, depending on just how they're framed. Prominent among them is the proposal for a large investment in infrastructure that is very badly needed in the United States. This is actually an early program of the Obama administration. It was killed by the Republican wrecking machine, which was quite publicly devoted to making the country ungovernable as long as they were not in charge. Well, now they're in charge, and they might implement the Obama policies, though in ways that are much more perilous than it would have been in earlier years because of the accompanying fiscal policies, namely sharp cutbacks in taxes for the wealthy and for the corporate sector, no new sources of revenue, and a great increase in the already bloated Pentagon budget. For these reasons, the plans are anticipated to greatly increase the deficit. But at this point, the Republican Party will probably resort to Dick Cheney's instruction to Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill in 2002, as Cheney told him, Ronald Reagan proved that deficits don't matter, meaning deficits that we Republicans create in order to gain popular support, leaving it to someone else, preferably Democrats, to somehow clean up the mess. And the technique might work for a while at least. When it fails, as it inevitably will, there's likely to be an ugly resort to scapegoating of the more vulnerable, immigrants, African Americans, Latinos, in ways that are all too familiar in history, well known in France right now. It's perhaps worth commenting further on the very strange spectacle of the isolation of the United States, the leader of the free world, at the Morocco conference that replicates now in a much more ominous form a U.S. rejection of the Kyoto Treaty on global warming, which pretty much killed that initiative. And increasingly in recent years, the United States has become isolated in other respects as well. It's a curious and very significant development in world affairs. One of the most striking examples is in the Western Hemisphere. Now, that was long regarded as what was called our little region over here, the words of President Roosevelt, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, a region that the United States runs as it chooses without interference and with any disobedience sternly punished. That was the historical pattern for a long time, until this century. In this century, the relationship has changed radically. For the first time in 500 years, Latin America has substantially freed itself from Western domination. The last century, that means U.S. domination. The International Monetary Fund, which has long been an instrument of U.S. government policy, has been entirely expelled from the region. IMF loans don't go to Latin America, they go to Europe now. U.S. military bases are gone. Recently formed hemispheric organizations have excluded the United States and Canada. And at the Summit of the Americas in 2015, it looked as though the United States might be expelled completely from the hemispheric organizations because of its stand on Cuba, which was strongly opposed by the entire hemisphere, in fact, the entire world. And that was surely the motive for President Obama's gestures towards normalization of relations with Cuba, to prevent the U.S. from being simply kicked out of the hemisphere. Whether these initiatives will be reversed by the Trump administration, we don't yet know. And if they are, U.S. isolation in the hemisphere may follow. Relations, of course, are already exacerbated by Trump's anti-immigrant extremism. And on a more far-reaching scale, much the same is taking place in Asia. One of President Obama's main foreign policy initiatives was what was called his pivot to Asia, an attempt to form a U.S.-based alliance in the Asia-Pacific region to counter Chinese influence. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which excluded China purposely, was intended to establish that structure more firmly. Well, that agreement, the TPP, is now likely to be abandoned, while at the same time, the China-centered Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is expanding. U.S. allies from Peru to Australia to Japan are joining the China-based economic partnership. The U.S. is likely to be excluded, just as the U.S. virtually alone has refused to join the China-based Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, counterpart to the World Bank that the U.S. has long opposed, but is now being joined by close U.S. allies, including even Britain, though the U.S. is out of it. At the same time, the China-based Shanghai Cooperation Organization and China's Silk Road projects have been extending from China to the West. They incorporate the Central Asian states, incorporate Siberia with its rich resources, India and Pakistan, probably soon will incorporate Iran, perhaps even Turkey, which currently has partner status and seems to be considering membership. So that's a system extending from China all the way to Europe. The United States applied for observer status in 2005, but was rejected. It's unclear at the moment whether Trump will withdraw from the nuclear deal with Iran, as he has threatened to do. If he does, it's possible that the other countries that are parties to the agreement, European countries, will continue to implement it, possibly even ignoring the unilateral U.S. sanctions. And if that happens, it would extend U.S. isolation, in this case, even from Europe. These are quite significant developments. They're related to the widely discussed issue of decline of American power. That's a complex matter. The peak of U.S. power was reached in 1945. At that time, the United States might have had as much as 50% of total world wealth. At that time, other industrial powers had been devastated or severely harmed. The U.S. itself, U.S. economy, benefited greatly from the Second World War. Manufacturing capacity virtually quadrupled. The U.S., of course, had unparalleled security. It was clear that such overwhelming dominance could not persist, and indeed it suffered its first severe blow in 1949 when Chinese nationalists, U.S. allies, were expelled from China. That's an event that's called loss of China in U.S. parlance. If you think about it, it's an interesting locution, loss of China. Think what that implies. In later years, other industrial powers reconstructed from wartime damage. Decolonization took its agonizing course. By 1970, the world was economically tripartite, three major centers: North America, Europe, Northeast Asia, that time Japan-based, China later rising to major power status. And by 1970, the U.S. share of world GDP product had declined to about 25%, by now somewhat less. Now, this is the standard account of the decline of American wealth. However, it's quite misleading. It fails to take account of the significant changes in the world economy during the period of neoliberal globalization. Corporate ownership of the world's wealth is becoming a more realistic measure of global power than national wealth. The reason is that the world is departing, even more than before, from the model of nationally discrete political economies. There are some quite interesting recent studies of corporate ownership, and they yield some quite striking conclusions. Turns out that in virtually every economic sector, manufacturing, finance, services, retail, others, In all those sectors, U.S. corporations are well in the lead in ownership of the global economy. Overall, the ownership of U.S. corporations is about 50% of the total. That's roughly the proportion of U.S. national wealth in 1945. And of course, these corporations are nationally based, supported by U.S. taxpayers. So we have a different measure of global economic power, one which indicates not too much change since 1945, except in the nature of the power. Facts that are unfortunately ignored in standard accounts, but quite crucial. Well, in the military dimension, the United States, of course, reigns supreme, no competitor. The U.S. military spending is almost as great as the rest of the world combined. The U.S. is technologically far more advanced. The United States alone has hundreds of military bases around the world, forces engaged all over the world. Here, too, there might be changes. Europe might take a more independent course. Perhaps it might revive in some form Mikhail Gorbachev's vision of a common European home, an integrated security system from the Atlantic to the Pacific without military alliances. That was his proposal in 1991, rejected by the West in favor of NATO expansion up to the borders of Russia, with the consequences we now see. This concept, Gorbachev's concept, has some traditional roots, in part in Gaullist concepts, in part in Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik. That could happen, and it could lead to a relaxation of the rising, very dangerous tensions at the Russian border, which would be a very welcome development. Well, there's obviously a great deal more to say about fears, hopes, prospects. Threats and dangers are very real. Opportunities do exist. And as we face them, we should never overlook the fact that among the threats that are the most severe, among the threats are two that are among the most severe that humans have ever faced, literal threats to survival of organized human society. These are urgent concerns. They cannot be delayed. They must be faced directly. It's the burden of your generation to deal with them, and they must be dealt with soon if there are to be prospects for a decent future. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup, Noam Chomsky, pour ce panorama très clair, ce scénario du futur tel que vous l'avez déployé. Il y a, je crois, un micro qui circule. S'il n'est pas dans la salle, je peux, moi, venir. Voilà, il est là en haut. N'hésitez pas à lever vos mains. Si vous voulez poser une question en français, nous la traduirons à Noam Chomsky. Ou sinon, vous pouvez vous adresser directement à lui en anglais. Nous présupposons que vos questions en anglais n'auront pas besoin de traduction. Voilà, là, je vois des mains qui se lèvent. Voilà, le micro va venir à vous, normalement. Voilà.
Thank you for this interesting description of the world situation. I was very interested by the contrast you put between lobbies, people who have taken power in United States, in France, in all Europe, and the citizens, the publics, which we are part of. And my question is quite simple. Do you think we have some chance of act against people which are organized, which have technological, military, and economic powers. People like us, which are atomized, alone. Can we face the situation like nuclear war or Anthropocene? And what can we do against the disinformation and the manipulation of masses? Thank you.
Take nuclear war. It's the greatest disaster imaginable, but it's also the easiest problem to face. We know the answer. For one part of it is that nuclear weapons can be eliminated. That, again, as I said, that's not a utopian dream. So in the United States, for example, this is advocated by people, a total elimination of nuclear weapons is advocated by people like George Shultz, Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State, William Perry, one of the leading nuclear specialists, former Defense Secretary, Henry Kissinger, who you know, and other notable figures who are by no means on the left, but have an interest in seeing the human species persist. There is an organization called Global Zero, headed by Bruce Blair, a noted strategic analyst, nuclear security specialist, calls for elimination of nuclear weapons. The nuclear powers are required by their own treaties to pursue good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. That's part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They're not doing it, but they're committed to it. Popular activism can press in this direction. That's part of it. But the other part, the more serious part, is eliminating the points of conflict. Again, if you look over the record of the last 70 years, it's kind of a miracle that we survived. There's case after case where national security advisors was on the phone calling on the president to send off nuclear weapons because of an error. The same on the Russian side. There are particular individuals who we know, whose names we know, who simply refused to transmit information and saved us from destruction. This has happened over and over. There are also very reckless acts on the part of political leadership which came close to nuclear war. This just can't go on, and the sources of tension can be reduced. The main one, of course, is at the Russian border. That's a result of the decision in 1991 to reject Gorbachev's proposal for a common European home, Atlantic to Pacific, and instead expand NATO to the Russian border, and mostly in the Clinton years, and expand its mission. The official mission of NATO today is to protect the global energy supply, sea lanes and pipelines. That's a global mission, meaning intervention anywhere. It's hard to remember now, but for years NATO was presented to the world as a necessity to protect Europe from the Russian horrors. Okay, as soon as the Russian horrors disappeared, NATO didn't disappear, it expanded. That tells us something if you want to think about the meaning of world affairs, political decisions, and propaganda. Leading statesmen like George Kennan pointed out right away that NATO expansion is a tragic error which is going to lead to very dangerous consequences, which we're now seeing. That can be reversed. Europe, for years, has chosen to be subservient to the United States. It doesn't have to be. Since 1950, it could have pursued what was called a third way, become independent. Could do it right now. Could move towards dissociation from the militancy of the Anglo-American alliance, Britain, in fact, has been the strongest voice for intervention and aggressiveness within Europe. With its departure, that may reduce. It's possible for Europe to take an independent course and to move towards accommodation, political settlement, reduction of provocative actions, maybe elimination of the tensions that are so dangerous. And the same can be done elsewhere, like India, Pakistan, which I mentioned. Another possibility, a strong one that's easily it can be implemented if there's a decision to do it, is establishment of nuclear weapons-free zones in the world. This has been done in some places. In the Pacific region, it was tried a long time ago. It was blocked by France, which wanted to conduct nuclear tests in the Pacific. Okay, that's over. It's now blocked by the United States, which wants to keep nuclear weapons in the Pacific Islands. But it could be implemented. Same is true in Africa. There's a nuclear weapons-free zone, but it can't quite be implemented because the US and Britain insist on maintaining large-scale nuclear weapons installations in the island of Diego Garcia. But that can be overcome. The most important case is the Middle East, by far the most important. The world has been overwhelmingly in favor of establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. In the lead in pursuing this is Iran, as the temporary leader of the former non-aligned states. The Arab states have been strongly in favor of it. What's blocked it is the United States. Obama again blocked it last year. Everybody knows why. They don't bother to say it, but the reason is to preserve Israel's nuclear monopoly. That's not graven in stone. That can change. And if you look around the world, there are lots of things that can be done. With regard to climate change, it's harder. It's not, in the case of nuclear weapons, we know there at least is an answer. In the case of environmental catastrophe, we don't know for sure. We do know that the longer efforts are delayed, the greater the catastrophe is likely to be. So there's plenty that can be done right now that can mitigate the danger, maybe reverse it. That ranges from research and development in sustainable energies to acts to implement policies that will mitigate and limit the crisis. It's not easy. What just happened in Marrakesh on November 8th is a good indication of the problems. It's not going to happen unless it's, first of all, discussed and becomes a major focus of organization and activism, but it's possible. Those are the choices you have.
Hello, sir. I wanted to know your view on new forms of democratic systems that are more local-based and that may be a way to enable a better outreach to people, maybe the less educated ones. So because I think we really like a lot your views on geopolitical issues, but I was just curious about your views on a more local level, if you think it can make the population more aware of things and empower people. Well, thank you very much.
So can more local activism make people more aware and invigorate them to carry? Yeah, very much so. In fact, towns and cities can do things. If national governments aren't acting, it's quite possible for the local initiatives to be pursued that will be both educational and functional in reducing the threats and tensions. Actually, even establishing nuclear weapons-free zones in parts of countries would be important, not only symbolically, but also in its educational impact. The same on global warming. If a particular, in the United States, state, say California, which has already partially done it, or even cities, impose conditions that require, say, 100% sustainable energy in households. That could be important. The divestment from fossil fuel firms can be significant. Doesn't change their stock value, but it has important symbolic significance, which leads others to act as well. All of these things can be done. There's many opportunities.
Hello, Mr. Chomsky. First of all, thank you for being here, and I think it's a great joy for all of us, and you've been an inspiration for many of us for our political engagements. I'd like to ask you about with the rise of Bernie Sanders in the United States, and in contrast with the rise of conservatism, especially with the last elections in France. What would you think about the intellectual debate? And because you've been criticizing, I know, French intellectuals quite a bit. And what do you think of who might lead the intellectual debate in the world today? And is it United States or Europe or whoever?
The intellectual debate. Well, take, say, the coverage of November 8th. Virtually 100% on the U.S. election. Virtually nothing on the much more important events that were taking place in Morocco. That's the intellectual debate. A huge coverage for months of the U.S. elections. It went on for weeks after the election. Almost nothing about the fact that issues were ignored. Even the two major issues that the human species is facing, questions of survival. That's the intellectual debate. It doesn't have to be like that. People like you can change the intellectual debate. Make it focus on what matters, okay? And we can see what matters. It's not quantum physics. It's right on the surface. All very obvious. Everything I said today is completely obvious and non-controversial and easy to discover. The point is to bring it to the focus of attention, discussion, and activism. And that's the job of people like you. You can do it.
Thank you very much, sir. My question is, do you believe that the liberal intelligentsia is going to limit even further democracy by saying that there is a new crisis of democracy after the unfortunate vote for Trump and the Brexit? Are they going to limit even further democracy by saying that the people are irresponsible and therefore they shouldn't have a right to vote and say what they want?
So people are irresponsible and shouldn't have the right to vote.
No, I'm saying that the liberal intelligentsia is going to limit democracy by pretending that there is a crisis of democracy because people have voted for Trump and for the Brexit.
I'll take the reasons why people voted for Trump. First of all, a minority of voters voted for Trump. The Democrats actually won the election by several million. The result is largely the consequence of strange features of the American electoral system, the Electoral College, and the way congressional districts are drawn to give extra power to conservative rural areas and away from more liberal urban areas. So that leads to results that are not quite the popular vote. But if you look beyond, there are good reasons why people voted for Trump. Just take the people who voted for Trump this year and voted for Obama 8 years ago, okay? Mostly working people in the old industrial sectors. Why did they vote for Obama? Because he promised hope and change. They soon discovered that there's no hope and no change. So they're disillusioned and angry. And they turn to the next person who offers hope and change, who says he's going to bring back manufacturing jobs, which he's not going to do, and other things. Well, is that irrational? What alternative did they have? Actually, there was an alternative, Sanders. But notice that he came to a very surprising phenomenon, the Sanders phenomenon. It's quite new in U.S. history. And for decades, 100 years in fact, elections have been pretty much bought. You can predict the outcome of an election very well just by looking at corporate and wealthy funding. Sanders came out of nowhere. Nobody knew him, no wealthy funding, no corporate backing, no media support. Practically won the election. If he'd run, he probably would have won, mainly because young people overwhelmingly supported him. Okay? Well, that can happen in a functioning democratic system. But there are many barriers. Here, too, have similar problems. Most people would prefer to survive. They would prefer to have decent lives. They would prefer to have the promises that are offered to them actually fulfilled. And if a serious progressive coalition can be put together that gives a realistic and sincere, it develops a realistic and sincere initiative to realize these objectives, can win elections here too. It's not a law of nature that in the French elections, both candidates are way off to the far right. That's not a law of nature. It can be changed by education, activism, and organizing here.
Mr. Chomsky, about Latin America and specifically about Brazil, you have already commented on Brazil's situation, but I would like to know specifically about the role of Latin America after the last recent events, the right-wing coming, the new right-wing coming up, and the coup d'etat and all the things. What do you think will be the whole of Latin America, the continent, that was preparing itself the last years to play a role of leadership at the world situation? But now, what do you think will be the whole of Latin America as a continent and Brazil as a country too, in the economic situation?
Sorry. Latin America?
Yes, we expected Latin America to become a great power.
Well, Latin America has changed a lot in this century. As I mentioned, for 500 years, Latin America has been in the grip of Western imperialist power. The typical Latin American country has a tiny elite of extreme wealth and a Western orientation. So their money flows to the West, their vacation homes are in the Riviera, they send their children to school at Oxford and so on. The Latin American elites had almost no responsibility for their own countries. You can even see it in the flow of exports and imports. You compare, say, Latin America to East Asia. Latin America has many more resources, much more potential wealth than East Asia. East Asia has developed, Latin America stagnated. Part of the reason is that imports to Latin America are luxury goods for the wealthy. Exports are raw materials, overwhelmingly. East Asia imports are capital goods targeted by the governments for specific investment in development, relatively egalitarian, and so on. These are policy choices. They're not laws. In the last 10 or 15 years, Latin America did begin to change. One crucial change is throwing out the International Monetary Fund. The IMF is an agency of the U.S. Treasury Department. It's one of the ways in which control is exercised over good parts of the world. Latin America's freed itself from it. There are no U.S. military bases in Latin America. First time. The major hemispheric organizations have excluded the United States and Canada. UNASUR, CELAC, totally excludes everyone except the United States and Canada. That would have been unheard of 25 or 30 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. In the past, if a Latin American country got out of line, there was a U.S. initiative which backed a military coup or in fact instituted it. Okay, not happening now. Now there were progressive governments in several countries that did institute some reasonable policies, but with deep flaws. One was massive corruption. They just couldn't keep their hands out of the pot. That's destroying Brazil right now, Venezuela as well. The other is that they were tempted by the rise in commodity prices and moved the countries even more than before to raw material exports. So Brazil, Argentina, and so on provide raw materials to China. China, in return, sends manufactured goods, cheap manufactured goods, which undermines their own industry. Okay, that's Venezuela is more dependent on oil now than it was 30 years ago. These are very serious policy errors alongside the corruption, and now there's a reaction to it. Well, the reaction's pretty bad in some places, but it's not the end of the line. I think there'll be a popular uprising to move things back towards a more progressive course.
Professor, what do you think about the future Donald Trump's team? L'équipe de Donald Trump, qu'est-ce qu'il en pense?
Trump government. Well, Mike, there are several aspects. For one thing, about the most predictable aspect of Trump himself is just unpredictability. He's kind of a loose cannon. Almost anything could happen. It's very hard to know what he means when he says anything, or even if he means it. Okay. But there are certain things that are pretty consistent. One, and the most dangerous one, is his position on climate change. That could be a disaster for the entire species. This spectacle in Marrakesh is just indescribable. In the lead in protecting the hopes for civilization is the repressive, autocratic country China. In the lead in trying to destroy the world is the leader of the free world, the model for democracy, the United States. How do you even describe this? And interestingly, it is barely being mentioned. Try to find some discussion of it. A shocking spectacle. Well, that policy, if Trump follows through on that policy, and if the rest of the world goes along, we're essentially finished. Not immediately, but not in the long distance. That doesn't have to happen either in the United States or elsewhere. Other consistent policies of the Trump administration are the traditional Republican Party policies. They're actually formulated mostly by Paul Ryan, who's considered the intellectual of the party. Sharp cutbacks in taxes for the rich and the corporate sector, eliminate benefits, privatize what little there is of a functioning national health care system, massive increase in the military budget, and what that portends is predictable. However, I think it's very likely that Trump will will implement in some fashion the Obama proposals, which the Republicans killed, for large-scale infrastructure development. Anyone who's visited the United States can see right away how serious that is. I mean, I remember my first visit to Europe was in 1953, not that long after the war, and the signs of wartime devastation were all over. Returning to the United States, it looked like coming to a paradise. Now it's reversed. When you come from Europe to the United States, it looks like you're going to the third world, even though it's by far the richest country in the world. Well, that's a sign of policy choices that have been made under neoliberal programs largely, to marketize, to privatize, to undermine the public sector, and so on. The infrastructure development is badly needed. But notice, and the question is how it's, and since the Republicans no longer have a stake in blocking it, it could be implemented. And remember that the Republican Party was committed to one policy: make the country ungovernable as long as we're not in power, which turned out to be a pretty effective tactic. But now they're in office, even with a minority of votes, they could implement it. How is the question? The sensible way to do it, and the original Obama proposals, were by government spending. That's the way you develop infrastructure, and it should be controlled democratically as much as possible to create what's needed, like better water systems, for instance, or mass transportation, or whatever. The Trump proposals are different. It's not government spending. It's taxpayer subsidies to private businesses to induce them to develop infrastructure which they will own. Okay, so the taxpayer pays construction companies through subsidies to build, say, a toll road, which they'll own and make profit from. That's not going to be an effective way to develop the kind of infrastructure that's needed. The other thing, it's being done against a background of fiscal policies which are going to explode the deficit, which would not have been true of the Obama proposals. Okay, that causes problems for the future, but the standard Republican position has been, as I said, we'll create the problems, you fix them up. Okay, you meaning ultimately the taxpayer. And I think this is pretty much what we're going to see. Now, within some not long period, it'll become clear to the working class voters for Trump, there are others like the religious groups and so on, to the working class voters that they're not getting what they were promised. There aren't going to be steel mills coming back to Indiana. There's not going to be more coal mining in West Virginia. What happens then when they're disillusioned? The reflexive reaction of an autocratic state to disillusionment is to scapegoat, blame somebody else, blame people who are even more vulnerable, like here, blame the immigrants, blame the North Africans, not look at what's happening. Blame the North Africans, but don't look at the fact that 2/3 of the people in jail are North Africans. Don't look at that and what it means. Similarly in the United States, similarly in Britain, the migrants that they're blaming there are from Europe, not from Africa, not from the Middle East. Well, that's the kind of reaction that is almost reflexive. Blame people who are more vulnerable, okay? See if you can divert attention away from the core problems to the people who are really in trouble, make them the problem. So you take a look at American voters for Trump, say they're not necessarily, the popular base is not deeply impoverished. They're people who are kind of cast aside by the neoliberal policies, but they live, they have houses, they have cars, and so on. Their anger is directed at people more vulnerable than they are. The image that's been used correctly to describe them is that they see themselves as standing in a line They've been working hard all their lives. Their parents worked hard. They gradually moved forward, the American way. Ahead of them in the line, there are people who are moving into the stratosphere with huge wealth. But that doesn't bother them, because that's the American myth. You work hard, you get wealth. What bothers them is the people behind them in the line, people who are worthless, like immigrants or blacks, who are being helped by the federal government and put in front of them in line. It's not happening, but that's the picture. The federal government helps the people behind me to get ahead of me. So I hate the federal government and I hate those worthless people, not what's really happening. That's the kind of thing the kind of scapegoating that goes on. There's plenty of examples of it. Hitler and the Jews, for example, an extreme case. It's happening right here in front of your eyes in France. And it will be happening in the United States, very likely.
Et une toute dernière question. Je ne sais pas où est le micro. Voilà.
Hi. Again, thank you. And I just wanted to come back to what you were mentioning about the lack of coverage, again, in regards to the COP22 in Marrakesh, and also making a point to the several questions about the need to be active for us to organize. Are there tools that, as far as manifesting or being active, that we can use to gain more coverage, to be more seen, as far as the very little visibility that these kinds of issues are getting in mass media?
Are there ways to change the
tools
coverage?
That you would recommend to try to gain more coverage?
There's plenty of means. Alternative media are available. The internet's available. Take Sanders again. They had no media support, attacked by the media 100%, but they were able to get around it, just as they were able to get around the lack of funding from the wealth and the corporate system. People can talk to each other. They can organize locally in a community. They can use social media effectively. And there are openings within the mass media. There are sympathetic journalists and editors scattered around. And with popular support, they can be given more prominence. All of these things are possible. They've been used in the past under much more harsher circumstances. So like, take, say, the Arab Spring. That had a lot of success, turned sour later, had a lot of success under much harsher conditions. The developments in Latin America that we were talking about, conditions were much harsher. These were people functioning in brutal military dictatorships. It's not like us. We live in pretty free societies. Some repression, but not much by comparative standards. So I don't think there's a lack of opportunity. I think it's mainly a lack of dedication to grasp the opportunities that are available.
Merci. Il nous reste à remercier très très vivement Noam Chomsky d'avoir accepté d'intervenir ici même. Merci Noam Chomsky. Thank you very much.